Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today it's just me and John, and we're going to be tackling a very interesting and sort of current topic after the very recent No Kings protests, which is dictators. So, John, could you tell us first what a dictator actually is and what the framework will be for our discussion?
Yes, Diane. So today we will be discussing dictators. But as you mentioned there, it's imperative when you discuss something like dictators to have a sort of broad definition of what they are. What a dictatorship is that it's an authoritarian form of governance where one person or a group of people hold absolute power. They hold total control over everything. That control extends to things such as maintaining their own power. Thus, a dictator is not freely elected. Similarly, examples of dictatorship would involve perhaps a control over the army to remove any opposition which could challenge their power. So it's this idea of having complete power. Diane, before we perhaps sort of delve into what defines a dictatorship even further, are there any benefits of dictatorship or most likely the negatives? Could you perhaps speak about some dictators? Who comes to your mind as being perhaps a particularly notable dictator?
Well, I think there's a couple of different types. You've got the sort of fascist European dictators with Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. You've got all the communist dictators, Stalin and Mao and the like. And then you've got this other sort of type of dictator almost, which is this military, sort of thuggish dictator a little bit, who just, it's not very much ideologically sort of based in the two factions, but someone like Idi Amin,
Yeah.
which is more of ethnic, situation. But then you've also got maybe, and we can discuss this, the fourth type of dictatorship, which actually is the monarchy. Obviously not in the sort of way that it's implemented in Spain or Britain or sort of the Nordic states or, Luxembourg and stuff. But the monarchy in its traditional form, which is hereditary system of absolute power. So would you classify monarchy as a dictatorship, and what do you think there are? Are there any differences between one and the other?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the type of monarchy. So in the UK, some of the Nordic states, or the Nordic states and Spain, we have a constitutional monarchy. And I think, I'm a big fan of a constitutional monarchy as a form of governance. It sort of maintains the symbolic power of the monarchy, but that's symbolic because it allows for democratic government. However, you mentioned there, and I think there is a definite overlap between monarchy and dictatorship when it comes to absolute monarchies. These are ones that pretty much all countries used to have. Constitutional monarchies are, frankly, perhaps a more modern idea. I mean, I always think to Russia, Alexander II, Alexander Alexander III, and then their final Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II. These were authoritarian rulers who acted, I think, basically the same as a dictator would. They suppressed opposition, they put down revolutions, until the final straw. Obviously, Tsar Nicholas II fell in the 1917 revolution. But they acted in a very similar manner to a dictator. They held absolute power. But what do you think, Diane?
Yeah, I think to some extent there is definitely an overlap. I think for me where the difference comes, and this sort of not necessarily a sort of theory-based difference, but one that's a bit more practical, is that the monarchy has this sort of hereditary system where it passes from a generation to another. And dictatorships don't really tend to get that way. It tends much more likely what's to happen is the moment a dictator dies, there's this whole sort of upheaval in society, and either goes to a democracy or, there's a new dictator in place. And we've seen this, many, many times with dictators falling, then being killed, or, stuff happening. There's always something new. So, for example, you've mentioned Nicholas. He fell, and then there was another second communist dictatorship that came in, and then that fell, and then, Fast forward, now we've got another dictatorship in Russia. So you've basically got this system where it's not hereditary. However, we do have an outlier, even today, Iran. The former Ayatollah's son is now the new Ayatollah in a controversial choice. Many sort of people familiar with the way Iran operates, the way the Ayatollah gets chosen, said that it was going to be a difficult choice to make because one of the main reasons for getting rid of the monarchy and getting rid of the Shah of Iran is to replace this sort of hereditary system, which they've seemed to repeat it. But I think that's the main difference. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think there is some credit to that difference. I think a dictatorship is very difficult to maintain over successive generations,
Yeah,
whereas with a monarchy, it's part of its ingrained structure for it to be maintained over generations. I think of, for example, but it has happened with dictatorships where they have continued among over successive generations. The Duvalier family in Haiti, they were a particularly oppressive dictatorship. They sort of are renowned as being perhaps one of the worst in the world. The father there and the son, Francois then Jean Claude, they were successive dictators of Haiti. However, it was incredibly difficult for them to maintain power. And I think it's perhaps a rarer form of dictatorship. But another one that has also continued, and it shows how for a dictatorship to emerge upon successive generations, that each dictator needs really absolute power and no opposition, is the Kim family of North Korea. Kim Jong
yeah,
Un, his father and his grandfather have ruled North Korea since World War II. And I mean, sort of contrary to what many would perceive, North Korea is actually, there's a sort of oligarchy in governance of North Korea.
yeah,
And there have been times of instability. In the 1990s, there was the Great Famine in North Korea. But nonetheless, it's very difficult to maintain dictatorship over successive generations. There needs to be such absolute power that it often doesn't happen. A final one I'll mention, Diane, because I think it's quite interesting, is the Philippines. So their famed dictator was Ferdinand Marcos, who was the dictator of the Philippines until their People's Revolution in 1986. However, Marcos, who fled to Hawaii under the protection of Reagan, his son, Bongbong Marcos, actually eventually became the leader of the Philippines democratically. So it's quite interesting, that example, in that that is successive generations of a family. Obviously, there was a gap in the middle, but it didn't continue, I suppose, hereditary like a
yeah.
monarchy. Perhaps could you touch more on, you mentioned dictatorships and communist governments. Could you perhaps touch upon those with Stalin and several of the leaders across
Yeah.
Eastern Europe?
Well, I think, you know, communist dictatorships perhaps get a bit of a different rep than fascist dictatorships. If you think about fascist dictatorship, you immediately think about sort of barbarism and deaths and
Yeah,
killings and massacres. And I don't really know if that's the case for communist dictatorships when it should be, because some of the most bloody dictators are Mao and Stalin, and again, they sort of operate in the same way as the fascist dictators, so both are sort of equally as bad. But what initially started as a very ideological experiment, it just didn't work. People
yeah,
got there, and the moment they got there, they sort of, because the system was just sort of not working, there was a very high competition for resources.
yeah,
You got this sort of stratification of classes, even larger than before, perhaps, in the way that if you were in the party sort of area, then you had these privileges, and if you weren't, you didn't. And immediately that transformed. So the dictatorship in communist countries, I think, is some of the most abhorrent we've seen. Great famine under Mao, the concentration camps under Stalin. I mean, everyone talks a lot about concentration camps in Nazi Germany, and for good reason. But I don't think there is enough talk about concentration camps in Siberia and Stalin.
yeah. I mean, I completely agree. And I think the failure of communism as a system is embodied by the 1989 revolutions. that swept
Yeah.
across East Europe. And similarly, Stalin, I was recently reading something about who were the worst dictators in history. The worst dictators being a sort of idea which is very hard to define. But the top two were Stalin and Mao, purely just because they were abhorrent people who killed a huge level, an unprecedented number of people. Stalin killed millions across his programs of collectivization, also his aims to industrialize Russia. Similarly, collectivization, that was his communist agricultural policy, killed at least 5 million in Ukraine, known as the Holodomor. And similarly, they were extremely oppressive towards opponents, tens of millions in gulags,
Yeah.
in Stalin. Similarly for Mao, I think Mao is most likely the dictator which killed the highest number of people, unfortunately. Mao killed in his Great Famine, some estimate up to 30 million. I
Yeah.
mean, it was a huge failure. His Great Leap Forward as well was just a huge failure
It's
in sort of every
not a
single
leap
way.
forward.
Yeah, it wasn't a leap forward. Actually, the GDP of China didn't grow in that period. It was until another, perhaps, dictator, Deng Xiaoping, until China really progressed economically. So, yes, I think communist dictatorships are a very interesting part of dictatorships. Sort of 19th, late 19th century thing. They only emerged really after the Second World War, largely. But they really do. I think there is a definite, one can definitely say communism failed because of the failure of some of those. Obviously, in China, there's perhaps a far more revisionist version
Yeah.
of their communist dictatorship. But in places like Russia, across East Europe,
Cuba.
there's been a move slightly away, perhaps less with Cuba, that's more revisionist, but really in East Europe and Russia, they've moved completely away from the communism which used to be there. Diane, another interesting idea regarding dictatorships is this idea of a benevolent dictatorship. Lee Kuan Yew, for example, the leader of Singapore between 1959 to 1991, is sometimes called a benevolent dictator. So do you think such thing as a benevolent dictatorship exists?
I think a dictator can be benevolent if they decide to stop the dictatorship and allow for democratic elections to take place. I think that's as far as benevolence goes. Because whether you oppress or not, whether you kill or not, whether you do these atrocities or not, I think benevolent is not the right term because you're not allowing people to sort of make their decision. And in some cases, that decision may not be you. You know, you've got your own agenda, and then by not allowing others with a different agenda to sort of run and to sort of express their points and address the large public and to allow that public to make a decision between the two candidates, I think you're simply not benevolent, right?
Okay.
On the other hand, if you've got free and fair elections and you don't have a term limit and you win 4, 5, 6 in a row because you're so popular, fine. I don't think there's an issue with that. I think some people may make an argument that, okay, it's slippery slope, sure. But let's say in an ideal world, if you got fair and free elections every time and you win every time because you're just that good, I don't see a problem. But if you're actively not allowing people to basically fire you, then I don't think you're benevolent.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting notion, benevolent dictatorship. I think, as you mentioned there, the whole idea really focuses on the ends rather than the means. It doesn't focus as much, perhaps, on how they took power or how they ruled, but rather the consequences. I think
Yeah.
typically one could view a benevolent dictatorship as being characterized as such for someone perhaps as Lee Kuan Yew because of his economic success, which many will view makes him a benevolent dictator. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew, for example, transformed Singapore's economy from a bit after World War II when he founded the People's Action Party in Singapore in 1953. And he led Singapore until 1991. He imposed strict policies, which some would view as being very oppressive and not benevolent.
Yeah.
However, his economic growth in Singapore, his public health, which 80% of Singaporeans lived in, some would view as very successful. So what I think it shows is that it's what you effectively value more um, defines a benevolent dictatorship. If you value perhaps Western principles of a liberal democracy, of being able to freely have elections, like we do, Diane,
Yeah.
um, for some, that is what benevolence is. However, for others, it is things like economic success, social policies. So I think this whole notion of benevolence dictatorship, it's what you value more, as simply as we said. We in the West value liberal democracy as being more effective than an autocracy.
Yeah. I think you're definitely right there, because benevolent can be interpreted in the sort of, as you've said, in the results, and that have you done almost what's good for the country, and have you done that? But it also can be interpreted as, have you acted morally throughout? And I think especially these long sort of 35-year-old, 40-year-old terms, and this long period of time, that you're not going to be at the top of your game throughout. It's just impossible. And yeah, you're going to gain experience, but you're also going to get physically more tired, and also mentally more tired. It's tough enough. We see with presidents in the US, for example, after 10 years, and they look drastically different to when they first assumed office.
Joe Biden, sort of in his 4 years,
you
hugely
know,
changed. Yeah.
Completely different. Obama, completely different. And then you sort of see them get rejuvenated a little bit after they finish. You see them sort of 3-4 years later, like, okay, they look a bit better. I mean, can you imagine that for 30 years and being that constant stress? I mean, Singapore isn't the United States of America, so it doesn't have to deal with the same sort of pressures of having 50 different states with their sort of whole systems and, all of that. But it's still a country nonetheless, with its own problems and its own difficulties. So I just find it bizarre that you'd want to do that long, if you
Right.
know what I
Yeah.
mean.
And I mean, I think the difficulties of being a dictator, as we sort of evoked, is an abhorrent thing for the people in so many cases. And I think another dimension of that, which you're almost alluding to there, is how many dictators are kleptocrats. They steal a lot from the state to effectively fund their own lifestyle. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines is an example of this. I mean, billions he stole from the Philippine Central Bank. I think when he took his helicopters to flee to Hawaii, they simply weren't able to take enough of his gold bars, of his wife Imelda Marcos's dresses and things. So they're an example of kleptocracy, which is evident in so many dictatorships across the world. And I think really that symbolizes how failed the system of dictatorship is. Simply if leaders are having to steal from the state,
Yeah.
something that is usually, again, the wishes of their people, it shows that it's not truly a fair system of government if you've got people stealing from the state. It's bizarre.
And also, I think it's almost impossible not to take advantage. Because if you're in this position, you can't be sort of taxed by the public. So right now, for example, if you're a public official and you get caught embezzling funds, let's assume you
Yeah.
can't go to prison. Let's assume you can't do, but there is no way you're winning the next election. You will be kicked out of government as soon as the next election comes. Well, if no one can kick you out because there's no mechanism in place, you're going to live the way you want to without much respect or regard for the people. And does everyone do that? No. And I'm certain throughout history some have genuinely cared for their people, but it's very difficult sort of sphere to police.
Yeah, yeah, and obviously, as you're describing there, this lack of accountability is a key factor in dictatorship. I think sort of material obsession is evident in so many dictatorships, but there's one where it interestingly isn't. And that is Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam and then Vietnam after the Vietnam War, who, interestingly enough, was known to be extremely humble. So I think the Vietnamese Communist Party built him a huge palace, but he effectively refused to live in it. And he also abstained from materialism. That, though, and I mean, Ho Chi Minh had many other flaws, but that
Yeah.
isn't true to say, though, for other communist dictatorships like him. We've actually seen with most communist dictatorships that this idea of, equality in possessions and, you know, not having private ownership really is not evident at all. I mean, could you touch on Ceausescu,
Yeah,
Diane?
I mean,
Yeah,
you've got many like him, but him in a time of sort of famine and great difficulties for the large populations. I mean, just lived in a palace, biggest, heaviest building in the world.
yeah,
Um, Always had and everything and helicopters and everything a head of state would have, but sort of a bit counterintuitive to sort of what he preached. And then even let's talk about modern day people. Like Nicolas Maduro. He's palaces and everything, and he's not the only one. So I do think and I think the head of state should live very well, because I don't think it's actually productive for them to sort of be worried about food and about other stuff.
yes,
I actually am quite against this whole thing that's happening sometimes nowadays with people like, oh, why do heads of state need to fly privately or whatever?
yeah,
It's not important. Let them do their job. But what's not okay is when that actually transcends from I'm just doing my job to I want to live in sort of extra luxury, because you don't need to live in the heaviest building in the
yes,
world.
yeah,
Kim Jong-un famously, he plays video games, and he's the only one in his country who can play video games. Like, if you want to play video games, like, allow everyone to do so.
yeah,
You know, that's not you playing video games and you doing your job aren't two things that
yes,
are dependent on one another.
yeah,
You can do your job without actually playing League of Legends or whatever. So
yeah.
I think there is that line which most of them have crossed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree that. I think in democratic systems, as we're saying there, leaders should be able to have a comfortable lifestyle.
Yeah,
However, in dictatorships, it's all too often that we see that dictators, especially in communist systems of government,
yeah,
have just been hugely indulgent and in a
and
total sort of juxtaposition to their beliefs and
yeah,
what
and
they
also I mean,
preach.
even on the other side, you've got people like Mussolini,
Yeah,
famously, womanizer, and lived in the palace and had all these sort of luxuries, and really sort of took as many of them as he could.
yeah,
So it's not, it's sort of universal thing with
yeah,
dictators, I think. Yeah.
yeah. And so, with that, we'll conclude the episode. So, today, Diana discussed a few themes around dictators. What characterizes a dictator? Can there be a benevolent dictatorship? And we also sort of at the end transition to the failure of communist dictatorships, using examples from throughout the world in the episode.
If you enjoyed the episode, do leave us a comment, a review, like if you're watching on some platforms that allows you to do so, and we'll see you next week. Bye
We'll
bye.
see you then.